Now, the topic of my discussion today is listed there as the myth of extinctions. But obviously, extinctions are not a myth. What it actually is about is the myth of what's been called the sixth wave of extinctions. In geological history, there have been 5 great waves of extinctions caused by a variety of cataclysmic events. And there is a popular myth going around that we are in the midst of the 6th wave of extinctions. And this question came up for me because I read a statistic back in 2001. And that was by a man named E.O. Wilson, who is a brilliant ant biologist and not much of an extinction expert. And he claimed that there were 27,000 species going extinct every year. 27,000 species a year, and he said that had been going on for over 20 years at least. And so that's about 500,000 species or so. And when I heard that number, I thought, what? I thought, how can there be 500,000 species gone extinct? My question was, where are all the corpses? I mean, if we got 500,000 species gone, what are the species? So I decided I'd take a look into it. And aided by that most marvelous invention, the World Wide Web, we can all do this kind of research. Now, Wilson based his claim on something called the species-area relationship. The species-area relationship is a mathematical relationship between the size of an area and the number of species that you'll find there. And in general, as you might expect, the larger the area, the more species. You find a certain number of species in a county, you find more species in the state that that county's in, and in the nation as a whole, you find even more species. Arrhenius in 1920 proposed that this followed what's called a power law, that the number of species went up as some power of the increase in the area, typically something on the order of the 5th root of the increase in the area, or something like that. What E.O. Wilson and a man named MacArthur did in a work in 1982 called the theory of island biogeography was to turn the species-area relationship on its head. They proposed that if you reduced the habitat, that the species-area relationship meant that the number of species would have to reduce, and so some species would have to go extinct. It's a plausible theory. And because the species-area relationship works, obviously, it was well believed. And it's become an article of faith among biologists. Now, Wilson said, some groups, like the larger birds and mammals, are more susceptible to extinction than most. Since I couldn't look at all of the species, I decided I would look at bird species and animal species. Now, when you go to look for the numbers and causes of extinctions, there are a couple resources out there. One is called the Red List. The Red List is run by something called the IUCN, the International Union of Crazy Naturalists, or something like that. They are a very alarmist group. And like most groups, they tend to hype whatever it is that makes their group exist. Since their group exists to prevent extinctions, they want to increase the number of extinctions. The other group that studies extinctions is something called the CREO, which is the Committee on Recently Extinct Organisms. It's based out of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. It took a very different tack. It looked at what is an extinction? How can we tell if an animal is extinct? So they started from the science end. They said, okay, what do we need to show that, that a species is extinct? Well, first we have to show it's a species. To do that, we need taxonomy. We need specimens. It'd be nice if we had DNA. We got to show that it's a species. Then we got to have some restrictions on how you look for it. I mean, just because somebody saw it once and didn't see it the next day, it's not extinct. So the CREO set up actual criteria, and then they went back and re-examined the red list and all the other lists to see if those represented actual extinctions. Unfortunately, they do not cover birds. So I was forced to use the red list bird lists for the birds, and I used the CREO for the mammals. The conclusions of the CREO are noted in the red list, and the conclusions of the red list are noted in the CREO tables, so you can compare the two. Generally, they're fairly close, although the CREO, because it has clear scientific guidelines, tends to rule out more extinctions than the red list. So I got both lists, and I got my trusty Mac, and I started looking through them. And the first thing that I noticed was that there had been several waves of extinctions. There was a wave in the 1500s and another wave in the 1700s, a third wave in the 1800s and into the 1900s. As I started to look at the number of extinct species, I found some curious things. First, the total number of birds and animals that have gone extinct in the last 500 years is 190. It's 129 birds and 61 mammals. When I say species in this talk, I'll be talking about bird and mammal species because those are the ones that I studied. 61 mammals, 129 birds went extinct, but when I started looking at them one by one, I noticed, man, there's a lot of island species here that have gone extinct from introduced species. I kept coming across species after species in the list of 190 that said the same thing. It lived on a little island, and then rats came, or mongoose came, or brown tree snakes came and wiped them out. So I thought, well, let me exclude those extinctions, because those are not the extinctions that Wilson was talking about. Wilson's talking about extinctions from forest reduction. He claimed that because we lost 40% of the world's forest by 1980, we're losing another percent a year or something, that this caused a huge number of extinctions. So I eliminated all the extinctions in those locales which had not had contact with the Europeans until sometime within the last 500 years. And that, of course, are the island groups around the world and Australia. On the island groups in Australia, introduced species have wreaked havoc. So I thought, okay, I'll get rid of all those, and then I'll have a bunch of species left, and I can check out whether Wilson is correct or not. So I eliminated all the birds that nested or bred on the islands. I eliminated all the mammals from the islands. I eliminated all the extinctions from Australia. And to my great surprise, if you look at all the extinctions that have happened on all the continents of the world, Africa, Europe, Asia, North America, South America, which is the vast majority of all species, in the last 500 years, there have only been 9 species that have gone extinct. 9. 3 mammals and 6 birds. It also showed me the reason for the waves of extinctions. The waves of extinctions have occurred, as I said, in the 1500s. Those were Caribbean island extinctions after the Europeans came to the New World. Then during the age of expansion in the 1700s, there was another wave of island extinctions. And in the 1800s, in the great period of colonization. Now, Wilson's claim that there have been 27,000 extinctions per year means that there should be about 26 bird extinctions and 13 mammal extinctions. His numbers made no distinction between types of species. He claimed that they were all going extinct and that, in fact, birds and mammals would have the highest rates. So that's what I'm looking for. But the historical extinction rate has been 9 in 500 years. Call it 10 in 500 years, that's what? 1 every 50 years. Wilson claims that birds and mammals have been going extinct at the rate of 39 bird and mammal extinctions per year. So I thought, okay, well, let me see who among the birds and mammals have gone extinct. There's only 9 of them. It doesn't take too long to go through them. In chronological order, the first creature that we know of, bird or mammal, that went extinct was an animal in antelope called the bluebuck. The red list says it was hunted by European settlers throughout the 1700s, and the last of the species was killed about 1800. No mention of habitat. The next of the 9 is the Labrador duck. Red list says shooting and trapping on the winter quarters were proximate factors in the species extinction. Overharvest of birds and eggs on the breeding grounds could also have been a factor. Yes, I think it could have. The next species is the Algerian gazelle. This one we only know from a single skin. One skin, purchased in a marketplace in North Africa in 1894. Oh, there's an adult male skull of the species as well. We don't know why it went extinct. We don't know anything about it, really. Then you have the Carolina parakeet. This was a lovely bird, the only parakeet in North America, or in the US. It was hunted for food, and it had the tragic attribute of having lovely feathers at a time when women's hats with lovely feathers were in fashion. It also ate bees, and so the beekeepers didn't like it. So it was hunted for food, it was hunted for the millinery trade, and it was hunted for bee protection. It was hunted to extinction. Now, the red list says it was also affected by deforestation. But given that deforestation has occurred in just about any place you can name, there's no species that we couldn't say that for. You name a forest somewhere, it's seen some deforestation, and if a bird species goes extinct there, you can be sure that the red list will list deforestation as part of the problem. But the real problem was it was hunted to death. We had the slender-billed grackle. This poor sucker, it lived in one tiny place in the Lerma marshlands in Mexico, and humans came in and drained the marsh entirely. This is the only extinction that has anything to do with habitat. It went extinct not from habitat reduction, but from habitat total destruction. And any species will go extinct from that. Then we have that poster child of extinctions, the passenger pigeon. They used to be so thick that when they flew over, they would darken the sky for hours. Hours. It was one of the most prolific birds in the US. The red list, again, says Newcastle disease, extensive hunting, and the breakdown of social facilitation. Okay. The real reason was we hunted passenger pigeons on a scale never seen before or since. They used to bring thousands of people out, armed with guns, to where the passenger pigeons were known to land in their migrations. They would bring railroad cars up, and they would sit there and shoot them until there were none left, throw them in the railroad car, and ship them off to the East Coast. As you might imagine, That was the major feature of their death. Finally, there are a couple of grebes, which are the last two birds. The Columbian Grebe was affected by siltation, pesticide pollution, disruption by reed harvesting, hunting, and perhaps most important, predation by introduced rainbow trout. So it is another victim of alien species. And finally, among the birds, we had the Atitlan Grebe. It lived on an island in Lake Atitlan, a rather pretty island. I've been there. And I probably should have excluded it on that basis, but I didn't. I left it in. It went out in part, well, there was a number of things. There was pressure on breeding sites from reed cutting. The government game warden who was in charge of the island was murdered in 1982 and not replaced. The lake levels fell and increasing boat traffic, but the main reason was predation by the largemouth bass, which was introduced into Lake Atitlan. And curiously, since its extinction, it has been replaced by a very closely related grebe species. Because in nature, as in developing countries, houses don't stay empty for long. So another species moved in, and in fact, it is such a closely related species that some biologists say that it is just another variant of the species that went extinct. Finally, we have the Omatilme cottontail rabbit. It's known from 3 specimens that were collected in 1991 in a small area in Mexico. When they went back to look, there were none. They looked all around, they looked again, they looked again, and they looked again, and they declared it extinct. Why did it go extinct? Nobody knows. But let me suggest that after millions of years of evolution, a creature that has only managed to colonize a space the size of this ballroom is probably not destined for a great future. So those were the 9 unlucky winners. What can we conclude from this record of extinctions? Well, the first thing we can conclude is that when European species met native species died. The number one cause for extinction on this planet is predation by another species. Whether it's humans or Newcastle disease or rats or mongoose or cats or dogs or all of the things that were introduced when Europeans came to Australia or Tahiti or any of the islands. 95% of all recorded bird and mammal extinctions are island or Australian species killed by alien species. The next conclusion is, when Europeans made it to Australia and to the islands, they had been isolated from the mainland for something on the order of 40 million years. And there was a massive die-off when European species met the local species. But that was a one-time event. There is no place on Earth that has not been visited by Europeans for 40 million years. So we will not see another die-off of that type. Introduced or alien species will be a problem forever, but there will never be another massive onslaught of extinctions like we saw from that introduction. The next thing we can conclude is, although one bird went extinct from total habitat eradication, there is no record of a continental bird or animal ever going extinct from habitat reduction alone. It's never happened, as far as we know. This, despite the fact that Professor Wilson said it's responsible for 39 extinctions a year. Now, if we look at, say, the last 100 years and we apply Wilson's formula, his magic species area formula, to the reduction in forest, and we make some really conservative assumptions about how long the extinctions have been going on using Wilson's numbers, We should have seen over the last century over 1,000 extinctions. Over 1,000 extinctions in the last century or two. That's what Wilson's numbers say. Now, Wilson himself was aware of this slight discrepancy between reality and his theory. And he offered up two explanations as to why his theory was not always exact. His first explanation was that it's not known whether species have gone extinct recently because scientific procedure requires that you wait 50 years to declare a species extinct. Well, if that were true, this study, which I did in 2002, would have implied that there should be no species on the red list after 1952. But in fact, there's 10 birds and 5 mammals on the red list that have gone extinct since 1952. And the most recent extinction, the Omatilme cottontail, is recorded in 1991. So as I said, Professor Wilson was a brilliant ant biologist. His next explanation was that the species don't go extinct immediately. It may take up to 100 years for it to happen. And that, of course, is reasonable. I mean, if you cut down half a forest, you're not, half the species are not going to die as soon as the forest is cut. Some will take a little time, some will take a long time. Wilson said that it would decline, the number of species going extinct would decline after a reduction in a exponential kind of decay. He said that the exponential decay would last from 25 to 100 years. The problem with that theory is if we apply exponential decay to that 1,088 extinctions, we still should have seen about 600 extinctions by now. And we've seen none. In fact, even if we assume 1,000 years of extinctions, we still should have seen about 300 of them, even if the decay was over 1,000 years. A man named Stuart Pym has addressed this question as well. He claimed that extinctions in eastern North America support the theory. He said there had been 4 bird species that went extinct, and that was from the cutting down of the eastern forest. There are a couple problems with his claim, though. First, 2 of the 4 birds that he says are extinct, the red list says are not extinct. Go figure. And the other 2, which were the Carolina Parakeet and the Passenger Pigeon, they weren't required to live in the forest. And more importantly, they were hunted insanely. They were hunted crazily by human beings. They didn't die out because the forest was cut down or not. Pym also said that the Atlantic coastal forest in Brazil was another example. Atlantic coastal forest in Brazil started to be harvested not too long after the Europeans got there, because it's tropical hardwood. It's valuable stuff. There are 179 endemic bird species in the forest, and they have cut down 90% of it. 90%. Care to take a guess at how many extinctions of birds and mammals we've seen? The answer, of course, is 0. There is one bird which is extinct in the wild. It's called the Alagoas curassow. And its extinction was predicted, according to BirdLife International. It was forecast, the extinction of the species was forecast almost as long ago as its discovery. It was discovered by Linnaeus, first scientifically described in 1740. Why were they so prescient about its future extinction? Because it is a ground-dwelling bird that stands about a meter tall, is kind of slow, and looks a lot like Christmas dinner. And so it was hunted. It didn't die out because they chopped down the forest. They predicted its extinction long before anybody had ever heard of any of these concepts. Now, while scientists might have missed a few of these predicted extinctions, even if they're out by an order of magnitude, we're still missing 60, 70, 80 extinctions. Big numbers. Wilson's third explanation for the discrepancy was that these creatures are doomed to extinction. Okay, they're doomed to extinction by the inexorable logic of Professor Wilson, I guess. But he said, take a look at the red list and look at how fast birds progress and species progress down the red list from no endangerment problems to slightly endangered to threatened to endangered to critically endangered. He said, look at how fast the birds change down that list. Well, like a fool, I did. The answer is hardly at all. Instead of seeing the 39 bird and mammal species marching down the list every time, moving down one, the numbers just don't change that much. They change by 1 or 2. But there's no 30 birds and mammals a year that are going down from vulnerable to endangered and all the way down to extinct. Finally, I took a curious look. I thought, well, the red list is nice. It lets you divide things up and do searches on specific categories. If you go to the red list and you say, okay, I want to look at all the continental species, we'll exclude the Caribbean, exclude the Oceania, Australia, and I just want to look at forest species that are extinct. If you look at forest species of birds using those criteria in the red list, you end up with 2 forest birds that have gone extinct that lived on the Hawaiian Islands. And if you do the same for mammals, restrict it to only forest mammals on the continents, you get 5 forest-dwelling bats from the Caribbean. We have never seen a forest animal go extinct from any cause. Any cause. Check the red list. It's easy to do. You just call up the red list and you click on Aves for the birds and you click on forest for the habitat and you say, show me everything but Caribbean, and it'll bring you up 2 Hawaiian birds and 5 Caribbean fruit bats. Now, reliance on the species-area relationship, as I said, is an accepted tenet of biology. So my extraordinary claim that this is not true requires extraordinary evidence. Let me point out that I have given 4 independent lines of evidence that he's incorrect. The first one is the overall extinction rates. Overall, over the whole planet, extinction from any cause anywhere. Current rate's about 0.2 extinctions per year. This is down from a peak of about 1.6 extinctions per year. Wilson claims the rates are 200 times that high. And in reality, Wilson's claim is the extraordinary claim here, because he's claiming that the extinction rate is 200 times higher than the observed rate. He's the one that should have to bring up the extraordinary evidence. Second independent piece of evidence, continental extinctions. None of the 9 recorded continental extinctions were from habitat reduction. Next piece of evidence, speed of movement through the red list. Not happening. Finally, forest extinctions. We can't find any of them. And each of those independent lines of evidence shows that Wilson was wrong. So what can we conclude from this? Well, my first concern in this is that people do not use this as an excuse to say, hey, it's great to cut down any forest anywhere, anytime. It's not. Diversity is vital to ecosystems, and the more diverse an ecosystem is, the more stable it is against any kind of disruptions. Local extinctions can have large effects on local area, and it's a significant and ongoing piece of research about local extinctions. Clear-cutting forests for agriculture can change the local climate. And if you cut them recklessly, you may silt up all your streams and drive some fish species extinct. So nothing in my work detracts from the need to provide reserves and parks and wildlife areas. In short, allowing for other species in our plans for the future is essential. Next, none of this implies that extinctions will not rise in the future. This is a study of historical extinctions and not a prediction of future extinctions. And finally, none of this implies that habitat destruction has no effect on extinctions. It does have an effect, but it appears to be very minor. So then I was faced with the question, why does the species-area relationship not work? Now, one possibility is that it does work, but the Z factor, the power factor, is so small, much smaller than for numbers of species. But the problem with that is, if we want to explain the actual record of extinctions, the Z factor would need to be so small as to be meaningless. Another possibility is the exponential die-off is slow. But as I pointed out, even if that was 1,000 years, it still wouldn't explain it. And we have a huge problem, which is that if we want to come up with any mathematical relationship between habitat reduction and extinction, we have to deal with the fact that 500 years of massive habitat reduction has resulted in 0 extinctions. This makes the creation of a mathematical formula rather problematic, as you might imagine. Now, given that we haven't seen any forest extinctions, and we've cut down half the forests on the planet, we must have wiped out some forest species' original total habitat. And the fact that we have not found them to go extinct means they moved, they changed. Forests are not cleared instantaneously. You start here and you start working out. The animals have time to move. But the main thing that seems to be making Wilson's theory wrong is that species, once they are created, life in general is incredibly adaptive and incredibly tenacious. Think about our experiments in trying to, say, drive to extinction a species like mosquitoes. Not real successful. Life changes, it develops resistance, it moves to other areas, it takes up other food sources, it finds different places to nest and different places to go. It even actually evolves because the evolution has been shown to go on much shorter time scales than we originally thought, on the scale of centuries rather than millennia. So in short, I think the real answer is the reason that E.O. Wilson's theory doesn't work to predict extinctions is because nobody ever gave the birds and animals the E.O. Wilson memo. They don't know that if you cut down half the forest that 11% of them are supposed to die. So, based on the 500-year record, there's only the weakest of associations with habitat reduction. So the first thing we need to do is move habitat reduction way, way down on the list of things. In part, the problem is that habitat reduction is a circular argument. Since just about every species has had its habitat reduced, the red list puts species in threatened or critically endangered kinds of categories because of habitat reduction. So you can't say Wilson's theory is correct because there's so many species on the red list. Those species are on the red list because people assumed that Wilson was correct. So the whole listing of species as going extinct for habitat reduction is questionable. Next, the 500-year record of extinctions includes the Little Ice Age and the subsequent warming. We see claims all the time. There was this famous paper study in Nature magazine that said a 1-degree temperature rise is going to wipe out a third of the species on the planet. And I thought, well, we've seen a 2-degree temperature rise since the Little Ice Age. Where are all the corpses? So climate also does not seem to be any kind of feature in extinctions. And this brings me to the real nub of the work, which is that if you focus on the wrong cause, the real cause goes on unabated. People have been trying to reduce extinctions by stopping cutting down forests, but that's not where the extinctions are happening. They're going on from alien species in the islands. So if you want to stop extinctions, and that's a good thing to do, that's where we should be putting our energy. It's the same problem as with CO2. We focus on CO2, and all of that energy and time and money that goes into it is not going into solving the real problems of hunger and poverty and the real problems of the world. Some people have attacked my study saying, well, you've said that the ivory-billed woodpecker is not extinct, but it's really extinct. So what? We're not short one species here, we're short 1,000 species. Whether or not any one species is in or out is immaterial to my study. We are short by this much, not by that much. And I think that is about the extent of my talk. So I would like to open the floor to any kind of questions on extinction, or heck, I've written on a dozen subjects in the last week or something, and 100 subjects in the last year, so any questions about anything?
I'm going to throw out three topics, and you can decide which or all or none of them you want to take on. And the first one is kind of directed at all the people who flew in here from out of town and out of state. We're from Los Angeles, and in this area that we call Mid-Wilshire, which is halfway between downtown and the beach, we have the La Brea Tar Pits Museum, where they've got some very well-preserved specimens of species that are now extinct, which are very well preserved in the tar into which they sank and died some 10,000 years ago. So if you want to comment on the extinction of the saber-toothed tiger, the woolly mammoth, and the North American lion, I'll open that up to you.
Let me answer this now, and then you can ask the next one, okay? Sure. There is an ongoing debate in the scientific community about the extinction of what are called the megafauna. These extinctions generally occurred in connection with the introduction of humans into the area. And they also occurred, in some cases, coincident with climate change. Humans came to North America as a result of climate change, because until there was a land bridge, there was no easy way to get across, and the land bridge was created by the ice ages. And so humans are thought to have been in the Americas for something on the order of 10 to 15,000 years since the end of the last ice age. So it's hard to disentangle whether it was the changes due to the end of the ice age, or let's say the little dryas period that followed it of cold. Was that the cause, or were humans the cause? Some people claim that there's an ice age to blame. My own feeling is that, that humans are definitely the cause. Megafauna have disappeared from not just the Americas, but also from Australia. And in each case, it has been coincident with the introduction of not just humans, but our partners, dogs. Humans and dogs make a real good hunting team. That's why we hunt with dogs even today. And megafauna, if you can find them, yeah, they're hard to kill, but if you and me and another 20 of us got out there and thought about it for a while and all we had was rocks and sticks, yeah, we'd figure it out. So we find things like places that the early, what I call not Native Americans, but I describe them as the early Asian immigrants. The early Asian immigrants would drive whole herds of buffalo off the edge of a cliff. Doesn't take any rocket science or any rockets to do that. And so my own feeling is that the extinction of those species is perhaps related to climate change, but in largest part, it's due to what has always driven species extinct. The only way that species go extinct in general is they are hunted to extinction by another species.
In the early 1970s, there was a science fiction movie called Silent Running, in which a giant spaceship way out near the orbit of Jupiter had the last known forest in these giant pods in the entire solar system. The whole Earth had been presumed to have been wiped out. Now, I have stood on the summit of Mount Kearsarge in the middle of the state of New Hampshire, and you get a spectacular 360-degree view from there, and all you can see, as far as the eye can see, for 50 miles at least or more, is forest. The entire state is forest with some cuts for roads and small towns and so forth. So is deforestation really everything that it's all cracked up to be, everything that it's been hyped to be? And even if it were so, wouldn't the answer be to increase the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere so that we could promote growth of forests with less water?
Deforestation does have effects, as I said before, and generally they are, well, I don't want to say they're not. Well, let me say that usually they are not greatly beneficial to some of the species. We clear forests for a variety of reasons, of course. Vermont, the forest, and many of the forests on the eastern U.S. used to be gone. And it is actually the development of modern agriculture that has allowed those forests to regrow. So I would say that what we need is not more CO2, but more modern agriculture. Modern agriculture allows us to feed many more people in the U.S. on much less land. We used to have to, farm rocks in Maine and farm stones in Vermont. We don't do that anymore because we can feed people on the good land. So we don't have to cut down forests on marginal land. The other thing that has saved our forests, of course, is that we've moved away from a wood-based economy. We no longer run our economy on wood. If you want to see a wood-based economy, look at Haiti. You can see from space, literally, the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic because all the trees have been cut down in Haiti. And so I would agree with you about forests that if we want to grow them back, yeah, we do in many cases. But the way to do it is not by increasing CO2, it's by increasing the energy resources and by improving our agriculture.
Thank you. Finally, the acute political conflict over species extinction and endangerment in California is the delta smelt and other species that are driving water policy. We are flushing millions of acre feet of water out to sea in the middle of our most severe drought in a generation for the sake of species that may or may not be going extinct. Can you comment on that issue?
Boy, that is a tough one. I've worked a lot in my life as a commercial fisherman. And so I have great sympathy for the fish, and I do know that I'd love to see my grandkids, if I ever have any, be able to be commercial fishermen. And the only way to do that is to be wise harvesters of our fish resources. Having said that, the idea that we should stop development because some bug that can only live in 50 square feet of area happens to live right where we want to put our house seems mad to me. It just seems crazy to me that some, what I would call a loser species, although I'm sure that's not politically correct, but a species that only exists in this much area, that species is in trouble, whether or not we do anything, right? And so to stop our actions based on that seems crazy, particularly given the fact that there are 10 million species or so on this planet. Are we going to stop all of our doing what we're doing so that we don't crush bacteria underfoot? It's crazy. So it is one of those very difficult questions, though, because we have a gradation from, let's say, some little bug at this end up to some iconic species like, I don't know what, polar bears or golden eagles or something at this end. Obviously, we want to save things like what are called keystone species. So my suggestion would be that we look at each of these areas that we're talking about and try to determine which are the keystone species for each of these ecosystems. Because if you pull a keystone species out of an ecosystem, it can cause big damage, and we don't want to do that. But I doubt that the bug that only lives in this amount of area is a keystone species. So I would suggest that that would be one of the criteria that we should add to something like our Endangered Species Act. Not that we want to protect all species, we want to protect the important ones, not all of them. Now, is the Delta smelt an important species? I don't know. It may be critical even to the ecosystem of the rivers. But on the other hand, it may be something that if it's there, it's there, and if it's not, it's not. So that would be my suggestion, is that we rebuild our Endangered Species Act so that we can at least try to address some of those gray area kind of questions and see if we can develop some guidelines for deciding, is this bug worth saving? Yes, sir.
Yeah, just a quick one here. Your presentation involves extinction of animal species. Had Wilson contaminated his information with plant species by any chance? And what's the story on that?
Okay. Wilson did not make any distinction. He said, other than to say that 27,000 species were going extinct every year and that the birds and mammals were more likely to be extinct. Other than that, he didn't say. Extinction is not too hard to measure in something like birds. For example, birds are great. They fly up in the air, we can see them, they roost, they move around, they're brightly colored. And because of that, every extinct bird has a common name. That's how familiar we are with them. The Omeltilme cottontail doesn't have a common name, right? When we start wandering away from the species that we're familiar with, it becomes more and more difficult to determine if they've gone extinct, just because they're hard to observe. They don't fly around, they're not brightly colored. It's some little moss that lives under some little rock, or it's a plant that is hidden usually by all the rest of the plants in the field. So the logistics of trying to figure out those extinctions rapidly gets very difficult.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I was sorely disappointed that of all the species that you mentioned that had gone extinct, none of them were of reptilian origin. And I've never been able to understand why dangerous alligators in many places are protected. So I would like to propose that we entertain the possibility of active measures to produce extinction of certain broad
It's called DDT.
broad categories of reptiles, especially those within the Beltway.
I lived on an island in the South Pacific for many years, and in the lagoon we had saltwater crocodiles. Salties, as they're called in Australia, are a truly fearsome beast. A fully grown adult male weighs about half a ton. And So there was a big outcry. When I first went to the Solomon Islands, the guy in the office next to me was a crocodile hunter. That was his job. He went out and hunted crocodiles, sold the skins. Then they banned that for environmental reasons. Seemed crazy to me, I'm a hunter myself, but they banned it, and so the numbers started to go up. There was some discussion about, lifting the ban, and there was an impassioned letter from some expatriate living in the country about how they were noble creatures and that we shouldn't disturb them. The next week, on a beach about a quarter mile from where I lived, a woman went down to use the beach. They use the beaches for toilets in the Solomon Islands because it's more hygienic. You just go down there at low tide. But she went down, and while she was about her business, a crocodile came out, grabbed her by the head, and dragged her into the ocean. She managed to get away, had 100 stitches all over her head and her face. And I'm thinking, yeah, okay, now all we got to do is introduce the crocodile to the expatriate letter writer, and then we wouldn't have this problem. So I can understand your concern about large reptiles. I've lived up close and personal with them, and it's rather nerve-wracking to know that they're in the area. Yes, Mark.
Since you have a minute left, I thought it'd be fun to share
Oh yeah,
this.
we got 7 minutes.
This poetry. I don't think it's a lot of meaning, but if you work hard, you might find some meaning in it. It's called The Trees. There is unrest in the forest. There is trouble with the trees, for the maples want more sunlight and the oaks ignore their pleas. The trouble with the maples, and they're quite convinced they're right, they say the oaks are just too lofty. Oh, come on, brightness.
And the screen is not too bright.
Yeah, the screen is not too bright. Can you believe it? I'm losing power right now. Well, in any case, it concludes with they make everything equal with an axe.
Oh, good. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment. I'm also from New Hampshire, and most people don't realize that New Hampshire is #1 in the U.S. for having more forest per square mile than any other state. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, I've seen pictures of New Hampshire in the 1860s, and then it looks like lumpy Iowa.
Yeah.
Yeah, all the trees are gone, everything fields, rocks everywhere. So somehow it seems like we should get some sort of political correct award for reforesting this whole state.
Reforestation award.
Whatever here. So it sounds like we're definitely going against the flow, and we're not getting any recognition. Anyway, my question is, I have a daughter-in-law who recently has got her biology PhD and is working toward being a professor, and we've had a discussion about species going extinct and all the things we need to do, yada, yada. And I was pointing out to her, well, I'm not seeing so many, where are they? And she kind of backpedaled a little bit and said, well, maybe it's not that there are so many right now, but it's the rate of extinction. It's getting way worse lately. And yet, I'm not seeing it from your lecture. Like, I'm wondering if I'm getting bamboozled a second time by my daughter-in-law. So, would you care to comment on that? Do you see anything as far as the rate goes of extinction?
The rate, yeah. The rate of, there has been no large jump in the rate of extinctions. In fact, the rate of extinctions right now is the lowest that it's been this century. Will it go up again? Quite possibly. Humans have this ugly habit of not being all that friendly to their animal neighbors. And in addition, of course, the number of people in the world keeps going up, and inexorably that will have to mean, I assume, that the number of species will go down. Finally, because of our focus on everything but the real problem in the world, which to me is poverty, we have all these poor people. Now, the great apes are in danger of going extinct. Why? Because they're tasty. It's crazy, because for you and I, the idea of killing a chimpanzee and eating it is unbearable almost. I mean, they look too much like us. But for a starving African villager, that's a great meal. So I think she's correct in that sense, in that the pressures are going up. Now, I don't think, though, that it will reach anything like the kind of numbers that are feared. And these numbers have all come from Wilson's work. My friend, Dr. Craig Lowell, and I wrote this piece up from this work, which was published in a journal called Diversity and Distributions, and then that was subsequently, I'll get to your question here. We're not quite done yet.
That was my question. Have you published?
Yes, I have published this piece. Dr. Craig Lowell and I published it. And then subsequently, there was a piece in Nature magazine that said Professor Wilson's species area relationship overestimates the number of extinctions. And I thought, yeah, well, if you get any number other than 0, it's an overestimation. So I do think they're correct. They were not willing to grasp the nettle and say that it doesn't work. That was a bridge too far. But they did say that his work overestimates the number. So I would suggest that you talk to your daughter-in-law about these questions and recommend her to my work or to the Nature article or to some of the other articles. Again, I am not saying that extinction is a meaningless event. Any kind of extinction, I mean, as John Donne remarked, no man is an island, and every species extinction affects me as well. But it's not happening at the rate that Wilson said. It's not the 6th wave of extinctions. It is a real issue, though. The problem is that people think that extinction is a good measure of how much we're affecting the environment. It's not. It's a terrible measure because life is so tenacious. You're much better off to look at a measure like biodiversity, number of species in a given ecosystem. That's a much better measure of how much effect we're having on the environment. So my conclusions from my study were kind of twofold. One is that if we want to do something about extinctions, we need to do it where they are happening, which is where predation from introduced species, including humans, is going on. That's the first one. The second one is that it's not, let's see how I can, it's a distraction. It's not the right measure. Extinctions are not a good measure of what's happening out there. Whether or not extinctions are happening is not really connected with the impact that we're having on a particular ecosystem. Because extinctions are global. If you want to look at extinctions that are important, look at local extinctions. You know, when the mountain lions left Colorado or New Hampshire or something, things changed. They became locally extinct and things changed a lot because they're a keystone species. So my study does not say that extinctions are not happening, does not say that they may not rise in the future. It provides a guideline to how to think about them and how to act to reduce them. Thank you.